Welcome to Illuminating Catholics, podcast of the Diocese of Sioux City. I'm Dawn Prosser, Director of Communications for the Diocese. Together with Carmen Bauer of the Faith Formation Office, we will shed light upon topics of faith in the modern church. Our guests include Catholic clergy, religious sisters, and other experts in their fields to help us understand what's happening in the church today. We will explore issues, even the tough ones, and to find answers to common questions about Catholicism. Thank you for joining us for today's Illuminating Catholics, shedding light to understand the modern church.
Hello, and welcome back to the Illuminating Catholics podcast. I am Carmen Bauer, the Director of Faith Formation for the Diocese of Sioux City.
And I'm Dawn Prosser, Director of Communications for the Diocese.
We are so excited that you've joined us today for this episode. We have been so blessed with listeners following us on platforms from YouTube to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as our website. So thank you for listening wherever you find us. We have been so blessed with a variety of Catholic speakers connected to our diocese, and there are so many more on our schedule. Today is no exception as we welcome Deacon Jake Rosenmeyer back to the diocese on his Christmas break. Merry Christmas Eve to you, Deacon Rosenmeyer.
Merry Christmas Eve to both of you. Thanks for having me.
It's nice for you to spend your holiday with us. We won't mention that we're actually recording this ahead of time. No, we are thrilled that you were able to actually come into the studio with us. So there might actually be some people in the diocese that don't know who you are. I know that's hard to believe, Deacon, but if you could share with us a little bit about where you're from, where you grew up, a little bit about your vocation, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I would imagine there's a lot of people in the diocese that don't know who I am. But I liked, Father Tim said, there's a lot of people that he doesn't know, and I think that's important too. There's a lot. It's good to always get to know folks. So I'm from a small farm community in Kossuth County, St. Benedict, Iowa. More people have probably not heard of that, but small little farm community. So I went to Garrigan for school, K-12. Then I came out to Briarcliff for college for 4 years, where I studied theology, education, and history. Then I went back to Garrigan for 4 years to teach middle school and high school, worked in campus ministry and a number of other activities. And then it was in that time that I discerned my call into the seminary. So I just finished my 5.5-year mark in the seminary, however many semesters that is. I'm not good at fast math. But we just took finals, so I'm back. I'm scheduled to be ordained a priest June 7th of 2025. Assuming everything continues to go smoothly, which I think it will. So I'm excited for that.
We're excited for that too.
We are. I feel like you have such every one of our priests has a great connection to our diocese, is from the diocese, but I've known you for a long time, and I just feel like you very much have a heart for especially those who are in the rural communities of our diocese. What excites you about being able to serve in a diocese that is with the buildup and the makeup of the Diocese of Sioux City?
What always has excited me in our diocese, we have that mix of urban and rural populations. Obviously, our urban populations still are pretty small scale, especially compared to like St. Louis, where I go to school. But one of the things that I've always been touched by is there is a lot of fertile soil, not only in the land itself, but in our people. There's been a lot of really good seeds planted by generations of really solid priests and men and women religious that have worked tirelessly for kind of the buildup of the church and the diocese and the lay faithful. And I think we're at a point where that ground, those hearts are really ready to just spring up. There's a lot of good things happening if you just look in our Catholic schools and what the diocese is doing. And I think even this podcast is an example of that. We're looking forward to the future and we're trying to build up, and how do we reach that next generation of Catholics? And so it excites me to be part of that growth and to just kind of see some of that come to fruition.
And I can definitely relate when we are out and about in the diocese visiting different parishes and getting to know parishioners and our lay faithful. I am in complete agreement with you. God is providing us with what we need to build up this diocese in the kingdom of God. He is providing us with the people, the gifts, the charisms, and I think you're right. The soil is very fertile and ready for that right now, just for people to say yes and to accept that grace into their lives.
Yeah, it can be really easy, I think, to look at what's going on in the diocese, especially with priests and parish closings and things like that, and mergings, and it can be dismal. But we have to look beyond that. I mean, we've done such good work of trying to get things at a point where my generation of priests can come in and minister in things. And I would just say, based on other people I know, other dioceses, we're doing the good work and we're trying our best. And that's an exciting thing, that we're actually still trying. We're still fighting Pope Benedict talked a long time ago about a smaller, more united, faithful church, and I think our diocese is going to see that in the next 20, 30 years.
Absolutely, and we're very blessed by your vocation, Deacon. Now, during your seminarian studies, as you're coming to the end of that, you've had to write a thesis that is full of so much wisdom, which does not surprise any of us who knows you. But, for your topic that you had chosen for your thesis, we thought it would be really fun to explore on an episode, especially before you transition into full-time ministry, to take a moment and look at the work that you're doing now to prepare for your time back when you return to our diocese and are ordained and then start serving in a parish. Now, you had narrowed your focus of your final paper on agriculture, specifically the Holy Father's first encyclical that he wrote, Laudato Si. Now, would you just mind introducing our listeners to what that encyclical is, I guess what kind of message the Holy Father wanted to send, and just give us a little bit of background and maybe what drew you to wanting to explore that topic?
Yeah, so I guess I would add a disclaimer first. Laudato Si, much of what Pope Francis says has been wildly interpreted across the board from every single angle and spectrum. And so it's hard sometimes to take a full glimpse of what he's saying, because he's not John Paul II and he's not Benedict XVI. And so Pope Francis, I think, the first thing we need to understand is that he is writing and posing a lot of questions. He very rarely gives the answer to those questions or the solution, but he's trying to get us to think, which I really appreciate. And if you don't see that, I think a lot of people get frustrated, especially with Laudato Si. It says a lot of things. But overall, his main goal was to open up this question, the ecological question. What have we done as humanity to the earth? So in my thesis, there's a part where we talk about, have we reaped too much? Have we taken too much? Have we relied on the earth too much in our lives? And so Pope Francis, I think, is just trying to get us to understand what, as humans, we've done to the earth for good or for ill. But he also then focuses on this connection between kind of land disparity and malnutrition, malnourishment, and things, and how that's directly connected to the poor. And how oftentimes, especially in the Western Hemisphere, in the Northern Hemispheres, the decisions we make about agriculture or land use and things have a substantial impact on people living in poverty in the Southern Hemisphere and in the Eastern world. And so he's really trying to draw that connection that our abuse of the land, or use of the land, abuse probably isn't the best word, our use of the land is tied to kind of this divide in wealth that we've seen that's just grown even in our lifetimes. The disparity just keeps getting larger and larger. And so he addresses those things, but then he also, one of the things I've appreciated is he draws a lot on, especially in the beginning chapters, a lot on the wisdom of the world's bishops. It's not just him coming out of nowhere writing this encyclical. I think a lot of people were surprised that this was the first thing he wanted to focus on, but he cites a number of bishop conferences from Brazil, the United States, the Philippines, Australia, so places all across the globe. One of his close advisors is Cardinal Turkson from Ghana, who certainly would know firsthand the disparity of wealth and poverty, and also dealing with an agricultural population. So he's just, I think, trying to look at that from a broad scale and get us to think a little bit more deeply. And getting people to think a little more deeply often upsets people, especially with a topic like this,
Yes.
Which is, prominent here in our own diocese.
Well, and I think a challenge is oftentimes it's easier to read a news article or somebody's small commentary on it rather than opening up the document itself. So I would encourage folks who have not read it. It's available online for free, and it's pretty accessible. It's not something that can be easily read in one sitting for people like me who easily fall asleep when I'm reading anyway. But taken in bits and pieces and looking at various topics, it is accessible for people to read and maybe draw their own conclusions and maybe see what conversation the Holy Father is inviting us into.
Yeah, you also can find like on Audible, I would imagine Apple Music, things like that. You can find an audio version where it will read it to you. I have read the document multiple times, listened to it multiple times in the last year and a half, and I still don't understand every aspect of it, and I don't think I ever will. But that's the point. I think we're not necessarily meant to get it all. It's just what are those things we maybe can draw, so when someone does bring it up, we can actually say, well, I've actually read it, and this is what I think he says, instead of relying solely on commentators. I think that's a good tip.
And we'll put something in the show notes to direct people to that document if they like and can read that. Deacon Jake, and I remember to call you Deacon, this is good. Change is hard. And when you become a father, I'm going to struggle with that too. But can you take us back, because I did look through your thesis, and talk about that scripture reference and kind of how you introduced agriculture and the land in that part of your thesis.
So one of the things that Pope Francis does as well is he roots all of this in our creation in Genesis. And so we know from the third chapter of Genesis and chapters 1 and 2 that God created the world. Right? He creates everything and he makes it good, and then he creates man as very good. And the first thing he tasks man with doing is to till and keep the earth. So the first man was a farmer. So there's a spot in my paper, my reader, who himself is a priest from St. Louis, grew up on a farm. He was giving me heck because at one point I make this bold statement that, this vocation to farm is one of the most honorable vocations. And he said, really? And he's pointing at my collar. And I said, well, you know what I mean. You're riding and you're just like, well, this sounds nice. It's really rooted in that aspect of man's dominion to till and keep the earth, which dominion, till, and keep have been maybe the most misunderstood words in the last 8,000 years, and how do we take those now today? And so we see in Adam this call and this goodness and holiness in human work. And I think that was one of the things that I wanted to kind of set out from the get-go, is oftentimes in our society, even today, work gets a bad rap. We don't want to work. If you don't, it's two sides of the coin. Work is terrible and we don't like to do it, but if you don't work, you're lazy, and all these things. And so we get all these false ideas about work. And it's important to remember that God gave man work before the fall. So work is sanctified. It's a holy thing to go out and work. And so tilling the earth and keeping the earth was a holy thing before the fall. And then we see even after the fall, man continues to work. It's just by the sweat of his brow now. And so we see that transition, which I think helps us relate to. And then, you bring in the piece of the cross. It helps us relate to the suffering of the cross. By the sweat of man's brow are you going to till and keep the earth? Well, certainly by the sweat of Jesus' brow are we redeemed. And so I don't think we can talk about the grander scale of the church without understanding that root in Genesis, I would say.
You also talked about the role, and you kind of referenced that, the role of the farmer. And with us being such an agricultural-based diocese, do you want to expand a little bit more on the role of the farmer maybe today and how they serve the earth and us?
So the farmer, I think we all know a farmer. I would argue that anyone listening to this podcast knows a farmer, because we do. We live in a highly agrarian society. I myself am the son of both my parents. I think would be their family's fourth generation farmers in the United States. Farming is what feeds the world, no matter how you look at it. Large scale, small scale, that's how we feed the earth. And we have this disparity that's brought up, and in a lot of places we have the food but we can't get it to the place, or we have this other sector of society that wants to demonize the farmer, and then we have a section that wants to raise the farmer up. And it's misunderstood and confusing a lot of times. And I think if we would go back and have a little more rootedness in that chapter and verse of Genesis where man is sanctified to work, and this is holy work, it would help the farmer, and I talk about this a little bit in the third chapter of my thesis, would just help him draw out really what he's doing and the importance of his work. And I mean, if you talk to any farmer, they know their work is important. And I think in recent generations, it's become very difficult because there are a lot of things that go into it, and it's a lot of reliance on the rain and the weather and things like that. But feeding the earth is a noble cause, and we need that. When we look at society that's urbanized and all of that, we can't find enough land within a city to feed our people. And so I think that's where the farmer's role really comes in. And I think I always joke that it takes a lot of, I'm not a farmer because I don't have enough faith to be a farmer. And that used to be fine until I entered the seminary, and people would say, well, don't you have a lot of faith? Well, I do, but I still don't think I have enough faith to be a farmer. There is a trust in God that exists in a farmer. There has to be. I don't know how you can be an atheist farmer, because you are so reliant on God's control of the weather and God's providence. And I think we see that in our small rural communities. That comes out in the people. Pope John the 23rd, famous for starting the Second Vatican Council, himself the son of very poor farmers in Italy, talked a lot about in some of his early encyclicals just farmers recognizing their innate dignity and their goodness of being a farmer. We've kind of seen another shift in society where dirty hands aren't exactly the best thing anymore. I would argue in our diocese probably 50 years ago, a man with dirty hands, you knew he worked hard that day. Mm-hmm. And he did his best to clean his hands up before he came to church. You can tell a lot about someone by their hands. And nowadays, that's somewhat frowned upon in our more proper society. And so I think there's a lot. It's hard for a farmer to kind of stand up and be proud once in a while, because it can seem like the whole world's coming down on him.
Well, I think what you just said there, it just reminds me of how you started, of saying that, just the people in our diocese are so fertile for, the Holy Spirit to come and, continue his work. And I think, again, that goes to the specific vocation of the farmer that we see in so many of our parishioners, that there is such a gift that they are able to receive from God from that time, working, that can be turned into prayer and reflection, and the wisdom that is gained through that care of the earth. I think I also come from a family where both of my parents grew up on farms, and in fact, the Bauer farm is a century farm, so so we're very proud of that. But I think even with my own history within this diocese too, I think there's so much fruit from that spirituality that can be lived. And I think that as we visit parishes, some people will humbly say, well, I don't know if I can serve as a catechist or serve in different roles at the parish because I might not be a theologian. But I would actually argue that spending any time reflecting and prayerfully working in any profession can sanctify you in such a way that you can share that experience. And I think in particular, agriculture lends itself to that very well in the way that one cares for the earth. And as you were saying, that there is a group of people who wants to villainize farmers, but they more than anyone want their land to be fruitful and productive and to be well maintained and cared for.
One of the other things that you mentioned is that farming and feeding the earth, a noble cause, and farmers have to have enough faith and trust in God to be a farmer. And as you were saying that, I thought back, having had lived in a rural community for over 30 years, I think the farmers in our parish were probably some of the holiest, most devout people in the parish. And I won't name them all because I'll forget somebody, but that really brought those people to mind, just some wonderful people. And also, in talking about the farmers, and I read it in your paper that obviously, there are a lot fewer farmers than there were 50 years ago, and a lot of that because of technology. And I know that you did delve into that. It might be a little controversial. Could you talk a little bit about how technology has affected the agricultural world, and a little bit about the Pope's encyclical on that?
Yeah, so the Pope, he is wary in a lot of ways of certain technologies, and rightly so. I think we have to ask the questions. But we've seen, for the first how many centuries of life on Earth, farming maintained. It stayed similar. We've seen in the last, certainly since World War II, but even before that, probably the last 120 years, we have seen such a boom in technology the world over, not just in agriculture, at a rate to which it's hard to keep up with. So my grandfather's dad would have farmed with horse and plow. And then my grandpa would have seen, they probably weren't, maybe when he was very little, he was born in the 30s, maybe would have still used a horse a little bit, but would have started using the tractor and the bigger plows and planters and all of those things. And then would have seen the rise of, GPS in the tractor. And I give my grandfather a lot of credit, God rest his soul. He loved technology. He probably knew more about it than I do today. And that was his favorite, one of his favorite parts about, I think, farming is how we could adapt it and use this technology for good. Actually, in the writing of the paper, I had a conversation with my dad and his business partner, who have both grew up on farms, have been farming their whole adult lives. Their whole lives, basically. And I asked, would you go back to a simpler time? And they said, absolutely not. They couldn't produce what they need to produce without the technology. And so, you have a tractor that will drive itself down the field, and you still have to turn it around, which is good, probably. There's a little fail-safe there. I know there's companies working on, just like cars that drive themselves with no driver. I'm sure we're working on that in the agricultural sector. That scares me a little bit.
That's scary.
Yeah, and so I think we need to look at some of this and see, is this for the good, or do we need to slow down maybe? I had an interesting experience 2 years ago during planting season. I happened to be home, and my dad and his business partner are working on the planter for a couple hours, couldn't figure it out. They call the John Deere mechanic. The John Deere mechanic can't figure it out. And then they call this little Poindexter guy from John Deere, comes out with his computer, plugs it in, and in 2 minutes has the problem solved because it's become that mechanical. And so I think that part is hard, where, most farmers, when you update, it becomes harder to fix on your own. Mm-hmm. So that's a challenge as well for, I think, a modern farmer. But we also have in the United States a way more technological farming system than most of the world. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one of the things the Pope is maybe wary about as well, is, again, that disparity of the Western world versus, I guess Brazil would probably be similar to the United States. But even most of Europe, still smaller farms, smaller land. The technology helps with the fact that less people can do more work. We don't have, like we used to in the diocese, families of 12, 14, 17 kids. That's just not the reality we're living in. So, I look in my own family. I have one sister. My dad has 4 siblings. His dad only had 3. But before that, there were 9, 10 kids in the family. We don't have that anymore. And so we have to do something, because we have some of the most fertile land in the world. It's just that there's scientific evidence that proves that. Yes. I brag about it all the time because I have classmates from Kansas that think they have it. So I'm like, you have no idea. You don't know what you're talking about.
I have the picture of it right here.
Here it is. This is the good earth.
Kossuth County soil.
Well, I think the danger with any technology is removing the human element. If we were to have machines produce everything we need, there would be a loss that humanity would have to pay for, and not having, that dignity of work that's associated with it. The earth was given to humans as a gift, for us to cherish and nourish as well. So, I think that for me is a little bit of where that danger of technology is. There are great benefits, but you just never want to cheat people of that opportunity to have that intimate connection with the earth.
And I think farmers, even though they use the technology, they're still out there in the field.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they have to be, because technology can't tell you why this plant is dying.
Yes.
At least not yet, anyway, as far as I know.
I think there's an app for house plants, but perhaps
that is true.
That is true. Perhaps that's a little different.
Which is fascinating. But yeah, so I think there still is that aspect. They're still connected, even though they use this technology.
Yes.
There still is, this is my work, and I've produced this.
Yes.
And the farther we get away from that reality, the scarier it becomes, because then we do lose a sense of even who we are and what our purpose is.
And part of the encyclical and part of your paper talked about call to change. And what is it that farmers can do? What is it that, like Carmen and I are not
as
farmers.
Consumers,
As consumers or just residents of Mother Earth, what can we do? What are we called to do by the Holy Father and by your paper?
So, so as I said at the beginning, it's a complex topic. And Pope Francis, one of, I think, the key takeaways for me comes in paragraph 202 from Laudato Si, which I'm going to read part of. But it says, a great cultural, spiritual, and educational challenge stands before us, and it will demand that we set out on the long path of renewal. And so I think for most people, for the world over, this is not an overnight fix. The Pope goes into various issues dealing with different parts of the world. So pollution of water, deforestation, emissions, things like that. Yeah, we need to be conscious of some of those things. And it can be hard in the United States, especially, because we do have an abundance of things. And so one of the things I cite is, for instance, in parts of Nebraska, western Nebraska, western Kansas, they're using a lot of water from the Ogallala Aquifer to irrigate corn, because corn's worth more money than wheat, when wheat doesn't need the same amount of water. And so I think for even farmers to be able to recognize, maybe I'm not going to make this much money, but I can make a decent amount and have a less impact on the earth, would be a good place to start, a good question to even ask. When I was having my thesis defense meeting with my advisor and my reader, my advisor just posed the question, because toward the end of the paper, I just draw one of the conclusions that it'd be very difficult to overhaul what you know and how we farm in the United States and things. And my advisor just posed, we're called as members of the church to have a sacrificial life and to sacrifice things when it's necessary. And he said, I guarantee you every farmer in the American Midwest is tithing to his parish. That's a sacrifice. Can you couch it in that lens of what's a sacrifice you can make here that will benefit, just like your tithing to the church benefits the church, what can benefit the farm for your son and your grandson? And so I think just even asking the question and being more open to the fact that maybe we don't need to use as many pesticides, or we can get by with natural fertilizer here instead of, synthetic fertilizer, or maybe even, for that's for the farmer. For people that don't live in an agricultural environment, I think the best thing to do is just simply try to educate yourself, which is with anything. We don't want to be ignorant. We don't try to be, but a lot of times there's such a disconnect between the food I'm eating and where it comes from. I mean, I think that even St. Louis once in a while, I'm like, I wonder where we get, where does this get shipped in from, in the dead of winter? It's like, because we can't grow all those things. And so even just becoming aware of kind of that surrounding, what does it look like to visit a farm? I mean, I very rarely met a farmer that is not willing to take you around his farm and say, this is how this works, this is what we do, which obviously that's not feasible for everybody. But I think education is a huge part of it, and that's what Pope Francis is really trying to say. He's just trying to get us to open our minds to the reality that we're living in, and especially asking those questions, and then drawing back to, how is my decision affecting people everywhere else in the world? So we farm, we feed people, but also then how does all of our water drains into the Gulf of Mexico. How does our fertilizer use affect that, and things of that nature are good questions just to start to consider.
I hate to say it, but you've given us a lot of food for thought. But the environment is for some, it's a controversial topic. When we talk about global warming and things, people have different opinions. But I know it's a huge topic, especially with some of the younger generations. It's really, really grown in importance. So again, we'll put something in the show notes. People can, or at least skim the encyclical if you're not going to read it all, or as Carmen suggested, take little bits and pieces of it. Before we close out, so what's ahead of you for your final semester at the beautiful Kenrick-Glennon Seminary in Shrewsbury, Missouri?
So I'm done with my thesis, which is great. Sometimes you get deacons that are well into second semester before they're finished. So I'm excited that's over. This last semester is pretty heavy. I think next semester is less classes, which is good, in order to kind of begin spiritually preparing for ordination as well. My parish assignment this year is the largest parish in the state of Missouri. Shout out St. Joe Cottleville, 5,300 families.
Wow.
But started out as a small 35-family farm parish 150 years ago. And so that keeps me busy on the weekends. My classmates and I are getting ready. In about 2 weeks, we're going to Greece and Rome on pilgrimage to walk the footsteps of St. Peter and St. Paul. Since we can't go to the Holy Land, which is the normal trip because of the conflict.
Right.
So we are getting excited for that. Next semester, I'm just excited to kind of engage in that last semester of formation. And then obviously the dream goal, the light at the end of the tunnel is ordination and being back in the diocese, which is super exciting.
I'll see if I can clear off some time and attend that ordination. Just kidding. I wouldn't say.
Who's going to take the pictures?
Actually, we've got a pro taking pictures, but I will take some too. So, Deacon Rosenmeyer, thank you so much for coming in. We knew this would be a lot of fun. If people have him as their parish priest in a few short months, you'll be very blessed. And he also has a wicked sense of humor and a wonderful cook. So, yes, you will have so much fun. We're so blessed that you said yes to the call, and that you always say yes when we call you for interviews and podcasts and photos. And you helped us to better understand the practical connections for us in this rural diocese, basing that on scripture and Laudato Si, and just talking about the different practices, just really, especially for me, not having a farming background, just to look at it in a different light. It's very interesting. So we're really looking forward to June, and we hope you have a wonderful second semester, your last semester, and enjoy it, do really well, study hard, And thank you again for joining us. And thanks for all of you for following the podcast. We get feedback, I think, every day. People that either they've binge listened, as Deacon Jake did, or listened to the podcast one by one. So keep following us, subscribe, and we can't wait to share our upcoming episodes with you. We've got a wonderful slate of guests coming up because there's always something to learn about the faith. Thank you for listening to this episode of Illuminating Catholics, shedding light to understand the modern church. Follow us for more episodes on topics of the Catholic faith. For more diocesan news, visit lumenmedia.org.